Welcome to Keep Talking, a community dialogue about mental health. My name is Maxwell, and I am the manager of continuing education at the Brattleboro Retreat. The Brattleboro Retreat is not only a hospital that serves children, adolescents, and adults, but it is also a hub of knowledge or learning for mental health clinicians from all over New England. These clinicians come here to see a variety of conferences. The Office of Continuing Education offers about 35 conferences a year, and we bring presenters from all over the United States to present their new ideas, their new research, but also a lot of inspiration to mental health professionals who are eager to bring that back to their agencies, to their own hospitals, and also to their private practices. I'm really lucky today in that I have one of those presenters willing to come in and talk with me, and I am so thrilled to have you here. This is Patricia DiBartolo, a professor of psychology and the faculty director of the sciences at Smith.
I am.
Also, you are the recipient of the Sherrod Award for Distinguished Teaching. Mm-hmm. And tomorrow you will be presenting at the Brattleboro Retreat on how trying to be perfect is no good at all. So welcome. I'm really thrilled to have you, and thank you for taking the time to do this.
My pleasure to be here.
Oh, good. Well, Patty, tell me, what was it about the subject of perfectionism, which is what we'll be talking about today, came to be such a great interest to you? What was it that compelled you to continue to study in this area?
I think it had to do with the complexity of the construct and what it meant. When I was an undergrad, I was reading about it, and one thing that struck me in looking at different literature and articles that were talking about perfectionism was that in some ways people were talking about it as a good or desirable trait, something that you would want in, say, a worker or in a partner, because it would be someone who would be conscientious and organized and orderly. And at the same time, I was also reading case studies in the clinical literature that were describing people who were paralyzed by their perfectionism and were plunged into deep depressions and avoidance and procrastination, and in some cases, ironically, failure. And it was trying to juxtapose those two aspects of what people were calling the same thing, and to understand it, to understand how it related to mental health, that really drew me in over 20 years ago now, and I've been spending my professional career with now, at this point, many, many other researchers trying to understand really what it is, what it predicts in terms of emotional well-being and or distress, and then a little bit about how we might address it or think about it in a therapeutic context.
Well, that was one of the interesting things that I kept running into as I was preparing for this interview, which was, is perfectionism a strength? As you just said, or is it a weakness? Is it a good witch or is it a bad witch? And I saw this definition on a website, the University of Illinois Counseling Center, and their definition for perfectionism, and I just want to read this and get your reaction to it. Perfectionism refers to a set of self-defeating thoughts and behaviors aimed at reaching excessively high and unrealistic goals. Just based on your research and experience, is that an accurate definition of perfectionism?
I think it hits the most important pieces. What has been really fascinating is to watch the field evolve over the past 20 or 25 years and come to what I would say at this point is a consensus about the broadest definition of perfectionism, and that is that it seems to be made up of two parts. And this is part of why there was confusion about what it was, whether it was good or bad or both initially, is that there are two parts that are distinct, often interrelated within a person, and they actually have different correlates. So the two parts are what you mentioned in your definition. One is the self-defeating behaviors and strategies. This is what many people in the literature talk about as being evaluative concerns or maladaptive perfectionism, the maladaptive feature of perfectionism. In addition, there's also another piece, which you also mentioned, which is striving for very high standards, which some of us call achievement striving. or more adaptive perfectionism. And so those two things are actually separable, and we found that when you look at the structure of how it exists in people when they complete questionnaires or you do clinical interviews with them, is that you can see those two distinctive features. And
would you be able to describe to me and perhaps the people watching this program today, what would those two things look like?
So the achievement striving piece, I think, is probably the trickier piece to describe because it sounds so good on the face of it. How could anyone be against the notion that we should strive for excellence or to be the best we could possibly be? Why would that be bad for someone? And in fact, there are many ways in which that striving, I always expect the best from myself. I set very high standards for my own performance, that those kinds of features can often be associated with positive outcomes, better, greater levels of self-efficacy, more positive affectivity, sometimes even better performance. There have been some studies done in classrooms to find out whether achievement strivers might score better on tests and ultimately in the course itself. The problem can sometimes be with achievement striving that when it is something that a person clings to too tightly, and that if a person is particularly unforgiving and or if they experience vulnerability or stress, at the same time they're setting extraordinarily high standards, that they can still be at risk for some psychopathology. The other piece of it, the maladaptive piece, is probably a little easier for us all to see how it could be related to negative outcomes because it is basically worry, concern, doubts that would riddle a person as he or she is attempting to perform either at home or at work or in school. So it would be concerns about making a mistake. Making one mistake is the same as failing a task in total. Or doubting about one's actions. I never quite know if I've gotten something right or good enough. Worries about failure, that their behavior is often driven because of an intense fear that they are going to fail in some really substantive way, not just fail a test, but fail as a person. And oftentimes there is that kind of the failure is infused in their sense of self as well. So that tends to be a much more negative piece. But those are the two things together. You can often find them within the same person, right? Someone who's a really high achiever who really is quite concerned about mistakes and failure. So I think that's why it's taken researchers and clinical scientists and clinicians so long to disentangle those two pieces and to understand them a little bit better.
Would you say that an achievement striver is the same thing as like type A personality?
You know,
I'm just throwing out some cultural terms that get bandied about all the time.
Right, and I should also say that the discussion about perfectionism is not separate from our common nomenclature or popular culture. In preparation for tomorrow's workshop, I actually was able to pull up online some celebrities who label themselves as perfectionists. Whether they are or not, or what kinds of features they have, is really not clear. So that oftentimes perfectionism does get lumped in with gifted and talented children, or gets lumped in with certain kinds of elite athletes, or, as you're saying, with type A personality. Some people call themselves obsessive when they're perfectionistic, which just means they try to get things right and be conscientious and orderly. And so all of that, I think, is added to the difficulty. Yes, there is a relationship to some degree with what we would probably prototypically call type A behavior. There is a pressure to perform in someone who's type A and would share a lot of features of someone who is perfectionistic. Achievement striving in and of itself, again, I think that makes people successful, right? How do you become successful? How do you get a great job or enter into a wonderful college or have success in a relationship? It's probably because you're looking to improve yourself and meet some high standard for how to be a good mother, wife, teacher, worker, etc. But I think a lot of it has to do with the edges of that. It has to do with what's driving that behavior, how forgiving you can be of yourself when things inevitably go wrong. And I think some of those features are a little bit different in perfectionists than they are in people who are healthy achievement strivers.
So how does one become a perfectionist? What are the forces that can shape that personality trait?
as you might imagine, it's complicated, and clinical research is just moving to address and ask that very question. How does this thing arise? Most clinical lore, both case studies and then clinical research, talk about perfectionism as being a long-standing either personality trait or cognitive trait, one that you find emerging very early on in life rather than something that would crop up only when you land in college or become an adult. And so the question becomes, what's happening then in children? Even though people talk about that, talk about how long-standing perfectionism tends to be and how difficult it is to change for that reason, there's been very little research on perfectionism in children, in kids. Is it actually there when kids are little? Can you find it when they're little if in fact people can remember always kind of having those same concerns, et cetera? So what happens in childhood that puts someone on a path to have evaluative concerns to become an achievement striver? There are a whole variety of factors. There's been a lot of focus on parenting and the ways in which parents might reinforce and inculcate these kinds of worries and or standards in their children. Everything from modeling, where they themselves are perfectionistic and very hard and unforgiving when they make mistakes, or on other people. So maybe the child is getting messages from parents or caregivers or teachers that they are not accepted or loved unless they are perfect, and that they tend to withdraw approval or physical affection when the child is falling short in some way. And yet, there are also theories that talk about the ways in which there are cases of individuals who talk about becoming perfectionistic because their parents don't pay attention to them or ignore them, or in some cases even abuse or neglect them. So on the one hand, these are very different parenting profiles. On the one hand, you imagine a very perfectionistic, high-striving, high-achieving family might be a place where perfectionism, yes, could bloom, absolutely. But then there are also cases in which people describe parents who paid no attention to them at all. And this was an attempt to try to develop some control or a means of getting recognition from the environment. So I think it's complicated. And I imagine that all of those stories are true and that different people land in having perfectionistic traits as they grow from a variety of different kinds of risk factors. That is, it's not one pathway that all perfectionists share, but there is something about the environment, about parenting that does seem to be really salient and important to develop these kinds of striving. The other thing that I should say, though, is that researchers have also started to pay more attention to child variables as well, because there are some instances in which, for example, research has found that perfectionism levels between parent and child tend to be stronger for same-sex dyads, so between mothers and daughters than between fathers and daughters. So it suggests that maybe there's something going on, a facet of the child perhaps, him or herself, that might also be interacting with the parenting. And there have been really interesting data that have found that temperament can often interact with parenting style. There are some kids who have a temperament that is more inhibited, more avoidant. They hate getting in trouble, and other kids who don't seem to care so much at all. In fact, there's some really interesting twin data that suggests that some of these personality features actually are heritable. That is, that they come kind of biologically wired to have a certain predisposition. And so it seems that it's not merely environment. So parents are not to be blamed for a child's perfectionism, but it's probably kind of an interaction, a continuous synergistic interaction between parent and child and environment more broadly, coaches and teachers and parents, that put a child on a path to have these kinds of features.
So when does the personality trait, perfectionism as a personality trait, start to morph into weakness and then morph into illness?
Well, I don't know that we have great data about that. Wouldn't it be fabulous if we could follow people longitudinally? There have been some real seminal studies in psychology that have been able to do that, but to really follow people longitudinally and see when are these periods of risk for, say, achievement strivers or kids who have evaluative concerns. I think that there are some data to suggest periods of transition or stress are really difficult. So as you're reimagining yourself and your identity, which may include things like going off to college, beginning a new job, becoming a parent, can often exacerbate those tendencies, and because oftentimes it requires some fluidity and flexibility in adaptation, that may be a time when, if a person's clinging to kind of perfect standards at all times and is a brand new mother, that may be really particularly trying. So it could be during those periods of transition and stress that it can really morph into something that becomes difficult. One of the issues with perfectionists too is that sometimes they're not very honest about sharing the difficulties that they're experiencing. So on the outside, they appear perfect. They appear that they have everything going for them.
And then they get reinforced by the very people around them saying, oh God, she's so perfect, she's so great, she does such a great job.
And in fact, perfectionists often self-conceal. They're not ones to admit mistakes or to seek out social support around mistakes. And it creates a veneer. It creates kind of a shield that can keep them from actually accessing normative social support that we all use when we're feeling a little down or disappointed or frustrated in our own personal lives. And so that can begin to snowball over time, where they get to a point where now they're riddled with and don't quite understand why they're having real difficulty, say, getting up in the morning and going to work, when work had always been such an important feature of how they defined themselves. So I think that sometimes it could just be that there's an erosion over time that can happen, where they just have difficulty hiding it, and it becomes more problematic.
So when people show up looking for help, I mean, when people find the courage to look for help, what would that look like? What usually brings people, what complaints bring people to a therapist's office, say?
It's interesting. Often relational complaints can bring perfectionists in. That is, that other people are recognizing that they're engaged in a pattern of behavior that is not entirely healthy, or that their relentless pursuit of perfection, their worries about mistakes and failures, to those closest to them, they might be able to detect that it's exacting a cost for which they need some help. In fact, sometimes it can create kind of a numbness or avoidance of emotional connection that can really be the reason that someone would complain. A partner or someone in family might recognize that someone's really struggling at a point in time. I think the symptoms just often can get exacerbated and tiring, and that can often be when a person self-identifies that it may be time for some treatment or treatment intervention.
That they're exhausted, or they get depressed, or one of the things I've also read about was kind of a paralysis setting in around making almost any decision or doing any task because of the sense of needing to do everything perfectly.
I think that's true. In fact, there are instances which, I referred to this earlier, the paradox of perfectionism is that it can in fact lead to failure. When everything needs to be perfect, it's never good enough. And so clinically, I've seen that rear its ugly head. People who've gotten one more semester to submit their master's thesis or to complete a course, and they just can't get pen to paper, can't sit down and get anything done at the keyboard. They write a sentence, the sentence isn't good enough, they circle back, revise the sentence, still not good enough, circle back again, never get anything written, and are threatened with expulsion or academic probation as a result. And that can often be a precipitant of coming into therapy. In addition, is that their ways of interacting at this point have resulted in a real failure or real stress in their lives. And so they come in realizing that they need to change the way that they're doing things, otherwise they're not going to be able to meet the logical requirements that are expected.
One question I'm sure that people in our audience would like to know is, what might tip off a parent that their child is struggling with perfectionism? What might be a time to get help for that child?
Again, I think developmentally, we're teaching our children all along how to emotionally regulate themselves when they're frustrated, and how to tolerate mistakes and losing. And this is a developmental task that all kids need to negotiate. So I wouldn't say that all parents should be worried if a child doesn't always win Candyland, that they need to bring them in for a clinical consultation. I think, though, there is a point at which it becomes problematic, where you start to notice a pattern, and the child doesn't seem to grow out of that pattern. So I think it's just watching to see how your kids respond to mistakes. And I think as parents, also modeling good reactions to mistakes. There has been kind of a groundswell of interest recently in education reform to recognize the importance of these kinds of characteristics in good learners. Good learners can tolerate failure. They're actually risk takers. They're very curious. And they're gritty, different from what you would find in an oyster, right? Grittiness means that they have long-term commitment and passion and perseverance, even despite setbacks or mistakes. And so there is a way in which we need to teach all of our children how to deal with mistakes and failures and how to really risk that, because one of the other things,
and model that to them.
Yes.
And take risks.
Right, and to provide them environments where that's really welcomed, right? Where the focus is on the really on the process rather than the mastery piece. And I think that we can do that in our schools and in our homes, and clinically it's often what we try to do as well, to say, making a mistake, the world doesn't fall apart and you won't come unhinged. Try it. Try making a mistake and see what happens.
And following up on that, I just wanted to, because I wanted to ask a little bit more about treatment, what's out there, what works, what doesn't. But I read this, I was on a blog, this woman who's a blogger and psychologist, her name is Dr. Christina Hibbert. And she said in her blog, perfectionism is a really, really bad boyfriend that you just have to break up with because he does nothing for your self-esteem. How do you break up with that boyfriend?
It's hard because oftentimes people, as I mentioned, recognize this as kind of a long-standing trait and way of interacting with the world, and are afraid that they'll really be giving up something essential about themselves if they were to not be perfectionistic any longer. And I think that in order to help people, that's a scary feeling and a scary place to be in, but I think therapists and clinicians can help people to start on that journey by asking them to try some of these things and to test them out, to get some education first about what perfectionism is and the costs associated with it. Because I think perfectionists tend to focus more on the benefits rather than the costs. And so even having a person articulating what are the ways in which this makes me miserable or interferes with my family or my life and work, etc., can be very helpful for setting it out. So a person can begin to think a little bit about what would happen if I made a mistake here. What would happen if I did something I wasn't good at all? I started ballroom dancing, or I tried downhill skiing, and I've never done that before, and I will probably look foolish, and I will not be competent. And how will that feel? How
will I live through that anxiety?
Right, and to use that as opportunities for learning, to see that competence doesn't necessarily define value, right? We can be incompetent in things and still enjoy them. Sometimes that can actually be kind of fun to not know exactly what you're doing in a particular environment. If you're taking a dance class or going to Zumba for the first time, it can actually be quite funny to engage in those kinds of things. And so I think
it's good for your brain too, apparently.
Apparently, to try new things. And I think that having people realize that mistakes do not mean that everyone loses their esteem for you, that you yourself could absorb that, and that it wouldn't necessarily mean that you're a terrible person or a terrible mother. I think those things are really important. I think the other thing is making connections. I think it gets, as I said, perfectionism can be a shield. I think fostering and asking people to actually develop human connection, which involves some vulnerability, can be very, very helpful. And that's true both in therapy and outside of therapy.
So are perfectionists, do they tend to be isolators? Do they get isolated?
They can, even in a room full of people. So oftentimes one characteristic that can often go along with perfectionism is imposter phenomenon. So it may be someone who is thriving and is the class president and is doing extraordinarily well, surrounded by people, even gregarious and outgoing, but in essence, they keep their most intimate self, their most vulnerable self away from everyone else and get a real sense that they're a fraud and they will be discovered at any moment. And so what often happens is rather than going and telling someone, I feel fraudulent here, I don't know who put me in charge and how I got into this college, they keep it to themselves, which just makes things worse because all around them they see people who seem to believe that they're competent or depending on them, or other people who they perceive to be competent, and they suddenly feel even less and less adequate over time. Sometimes the best thing to do is to say to the person next to you, I can't believe I'm here, or I'm really struggling. Did you understand that problem? I didn't. And then the person next to you might say, no, I'm confused too. You go, shoo, I thought it was me. I thought I was the only one. And so I think that making those social connections really can go a long way to helping to develop a better, stronger, more authentic sense of self. Because one thing that's really important in the context of, I think, therapy is that perfectionism is a myth. It doesn't exist, right? Being absolutely perfect it's not human. We are flawed. We can't, maybe every once in a while we might have a perfect day or a perfect presentation or a perfect project we do. But chances are that even those really, really, really outstanding efforts will have a little flaw here or there. And so I think that sometimes that needs to be recognized, that perfection is a myth, and that pursuing it can really exact its costs.
What are the treatments that work or that they have found work as opposed to ones that are maybe not so effective?
Well, it's interesting. I think that the literature discovered perfectionism in relation to clinical treatment by finding out that it actually impedes reaction to treatment or response to treatment. So in a very large scale collaborative study done by NIMH, they found in treatment for depression, where they found were testing a number of effective treatments for depression. They found that individuals who came into those treatments, regardless of whether they were receiving effective medication or effective psychotherapy, people who had high levels of perfectionism to begin responded less well to treatment. And so it does interfere with treatment. If you come in and don't say anything about perfectionism or don't mention that as you're presenting
you're still hiding in a sense?
Yes.
So it's hard for the therapist to break through the hiding, the mask.
Absolutely. And it can interfere. So if you come in and just saying, I'm feeling really depressed lately, if the focus is just on the symptoms of depression and not necessarily on the perfectionistic approach that you have to the world, then it might be harder for you to actually see benefit for the depression treatment. So what's happened recently is that researchers have been trying to develop strategies that specifically target perfectionistic cognitions and behaviors so that they can actually be more effective with the symptoms that emerge. And there are some strategies that have been tested. This is in its infancy. We're just starting to do some randomized clinical trials. There are some cognitive behavioral-based treatments that do things like work on cognitive restructuring and addressing the dysfunctional cognitions, which often aren't really grounded in realistic thinking. But
and you go put that together with some psychoeducation. Is that
and experimentation? So behavioral experiments as well, homework assignments that really ask people to get outside their comfort zone and then to observe what happens, given their predictions beforehand, and then really focusing on a person's core sense of self. So strategies around helping people to define what's important to them in life, what are their values and commitments in life, and then thinking about their own sense of self in relation to those values and commitments, and seeing if you can shake free some of the more rigid ideas that perfectionism tends to fetter people with.
Well, I want to thank you so much for joining us. And wow, this is fascinating. It's the carding of the wool almost of figuring out how it starts, how it ends, how to be helpful to people. But at any rate, I really appreciate your coming on the show, and that is super. And thank you so much to BCTV for helping us once again put on another Keep Talking program. We really appreciate your help, and I hope that that our audience will come back again and seeing another episode of Keep Talking, a community dialogue about mental health. Thank you.